Welcome to the Open Fire Podcast, an honest and informed dialogue on fire safety issues. We direct discussions with some of the construction industry's most prominent and recognised leaders. Your presenters are myself, Dave Calbert, Ops Director at Frank and Risk Management Services, and with me in the studio I have fire expert and Mr. CEO of CLM Group, Tom Gilbert. Hello, Tom.
Hello, David. How are you?
Very well.
Wonderful. I think you've hit the nail on the head with prominent and recognised leaders in your opener today.
Yep, we've got a special guest today.
We have.
We don't really want to waste too much time with our usual back and forth and what have you been up to this week.
You don't want to hear what I've been doing this week, Dave, at all?
No, actually, no, not really. Okay, we'll get on with the introduction. Okay, so our guest today, Tom, graduated from Imperial College, University of London, with a degree in chemical engineering, went on to join Exxon Chemicals as a process engineer, and rising to become the operational manager of the butyl polymer business. Then joined Harcross Chemicals as operational director. Joined the Chemicals Industry Association in 1998 as Director of Business and Responsible Care, becoming Director General from 2002 to 2005. She then worked in Brussels for the European Chemicals Industries Council before being appointed Chair of the Health and Safety Commission in 2007. She became Chair of the Health and Safety Executive in 2009 when the two organisations merged, and she remained the chairperson until 2016. She was President of the Institution of Chemical Engineers from 2013 to 2014 and Senior Non-Executive Director and Trustee of the Energy Savings Trust, a Non-Executive Director of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult and Trustee of the City and Guilds Group. In 2016, she also swapped job with the Chair of the Manufacturing Trade Body, EEF, with Martin Temple, who himself became the Chair of the Health and Safety Executive. Our guest also was elected a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2010. She is a Fellow of the Institution of Chemical Engineers. She was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2006 for services to health and safety, and Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2016, New Year's Honours List for services to engineering and health and safety. She was listed in the top 50 women in UK engineering by the Telegraph in 2016, and just last month received the Royal Academy of Engineering President's Medal, which is the highest award that can be given to fellows. Welcome to the studio, Dame Judith Hackitt. Thank you very much for coming in.
It's a good job that we cut down our normal intro.
I did try and warn you. It's quite a CV. That's not a bad CV, is it? So I think I'm right in saying you're currently chairing the Industry Safety Steering Group, ISSG?
Yes, I do. I'm building safety. My other job at the moment is that I'm the interim chair of the Office for Nuclear Regulation. So I'm now very much involved in the whole nuclear sector as well.
Okay. Many of our listeners and viewers will, of course, be more familiar with Dame Judith's role as Chair of the Independent Review of Building Regulations and Fire Safety, which was commissioned by the government following the Grenfell Fire. And with Martin Morbick's Phase 2 report coming out, or possibly by the time this is aired, already come out, we thought this would be a great opportunity to get you in the studio and just go over the kind of the history of what's led up to where we are now, and to get your opinions on how we've developed since 2017, how the industry's developed. Just to give our listeners a kind of a little bit of an idea of the reports that came out. The interim report from Dame Judith was published in December 2017. With the final report, Building a Safer Future, issued in May 2018.
That's right. Yep.
This was separate and independent of Martin Morbick's Phase 1 report of the Grenfell Inquiry, which was published in October 2019, with the Phase 2 report due out in September the 4th, 2024. It brings us on to an interesting a criticism that was levelled at yourself, Dame Judith, with respect, by David Lammy, who was the Labour MP at the time, now Foreign Secretary, when you identified that you weren't an expert in the Grenfell tragedy and had not looked at the details of the fire when undertaking the post-Grenfell review of building safety regulations. David Lammy suggested this was an insult to the victims and put question marks around whether your work was credible. I have my own view on whether there is grounding to what he said at the time, but I wondered if perhaps you would like to start us off by maybe just putting the record straight.
Well, there have been a number of people who throughout the work that I've done, who have confused the two and conflated the two. The reality is this: I have never met Martin Morbick to this day. Our work has been completely separate.
Yeah.
The public inquiry has been very much focused upon the details of what happened at Grenfell. It was kicked off before my work started. The remit I was given by the government was very different, and the exam question, if you like, that was posed to me was, tell us what went wrong with the regulatory system that allowed something as awful as this to happen. But what's also worth bearing in mind is that by the time my review was set up, the government of the day had already reached the point in its kind of fact-finding where it had that horrible realisation that what happened at Grenfell was not a one-off.
No.
You know, in that first few days and weeks after the awful events of June 2017, it became apparent that the level of knowledge that the industry had about the state of buildings, what was where, even the very simplest of questions in terms of how many high-rise buildings do we have, the data didn't exist.
No.
And so that horrible sense of we don't know if this could happen again was very much more at the heart of what the question I was being asked about. Is our regulatory system broken, and has it allowed us to build more unsafe buildings in addition to Grenfell?
So perhaps what David Lammy was missing is you weren't there to, and I think there possibly has been some overlap between what Martin Morbick was ultimately there to investigate compared to what you were looking at a much more the landscape of the construction industry.
Oh, absolutely, and quite clearly, you know, I have no idea what he's going to say in his final report, but you only have to look at what's been submitted in terms of evidence, and there is a lot of overlap. And one of the areas that I think we are going to hear more about, I suspect, in the coming weeks, is the whole issue around products and product specification and product assurance, which I said in my report, because of the time frame I was given and the need to produce something within a year, which was a very clear part of my remit, I didn't have the time to look at the product safety and product specification angles, which I would dearly have loved to have done. But clearly Paul Morell went on to do that. But I'm sure that that whole debate around how do we know we're using the right materials in the right applications is going to be is something that's going to come up again once this report is published. The inquiry report, that is.
In the foreword to your report in May 2018, that you kind of headed it quite clearly. Your main criticisms of the regulatory system for high-rise complex buildings was ignorance, indifference, inadequate regulatory oversight and enforcement tools, and a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities. I just wondered how far we've come since 2018. What, in your opinion, how do you think those areas, those main causes, have been accepted and taken on board by the industry? Do you see changes since then?
In any sector, you know, so it would be interesting to talk about what I've experienced in my career in other sectors, because I've been here before. I've seen it before in the chemical industry, the oil and gas industry, and so on, where something awful happens, and it makes a change in the industry that you never ever go back from, and you move to a very different place. Do I think that's happened in construction? Yes, sort of, but not quite in the way that I had hoped for. To me, Grenfell Tower is and should be, to this whole industry, the same wake-up call that Piper Alpha was to the oil and gas industry. It changed the oil and gas industry forever when Piper Alpha occurred. We owe it to the people who died at Grenfell and their families to make sure that the change that happens is not just for the long haul, but is so different from the attitude we had before that we demonstrate we're never going to let that happen again.
Do you think that the construction industry is still relatively ambivalent about the disaster itself and points the fingers and says, well, that's not what we did, that was that particular company, or it was that particular product, and we don't have that? Or is it that the machine is too big, or is it that there are too many assets? Whereas in the oil and gas industry, the number of assets that they then spent time to remediate after Piper Alpha would be proportionately a lot smaller than perhaps the built environment. Is it that, do you think, or is it deeper?
I still do a lot of presentations related to the oil and gas and chemical industry, which is obviously, as a chemical engineer, part of my DNA. But what I often say to them is because they're still not perfect. Let's be clear, you know, there's still, and the day they become complacent is the day you really got to worry about them, you know, and that's true of any sector. So what I often say to them is, whilst ever you focus on the what and you try and get to a single thing that caused something, you're in the wrong place. It's only when you stand back and think about why this happened and really get to the root causes that you will be addressing the problems. And that's how I came up against this really, really difficult debate around the time that I was doing my review, where everybody wanted me to say, we used the wrong cladding. Because that was the easy answer. And that would then have allowed everyone else to say, okay, right, we found out who it was now. Now, the rest of us are off the hook. And as long as we ban cladding, we can all carry on as if nothing's happened. Which was absolutely not true and is not true today. And I think, so long answer to your question, has the industry changed? Yes, it now recognises this systemic change that's needed. That we have achieved. Does that yet translate into the sort of collective leadership that I would have expected to see by now? No, not yet. But it will come. We will get there.
Where do you think that collective leadership is lacking? Is it from a government level, or is
No,
it within
no, not from government. And that, I think, is probably my biggest frustration in all of this, is that I continue to hear people say, but if you just tell me what I need to do, I'll do it. No, this is not how we roll. This is not how the system works. We have changed the regulatory system, and we have changed it to put the responsibility and the ownership with the people who do the work. It's not a revolutionary concept, because that's exactly what happens in other high hazard industries.
Yep.
And, by the way, you have all been working in that paradigm for 50 years under the Health and Safety at Work Act.
Yes.
Nobody tells you what to do. You have to manage the risks associated with your workplaces, your workforce. And all we're asking you to do under this new regulatory regime is pay the same attention and the same care to ensuring that the buildings that you build are safe for those people who are going to live in them.
Yeah. And the focus really in construction, from a safety perspective, predominantly is on the worker building it, and has always been that way. And it's
Well,
it's that mind.
hasn't
Well,
always
not
been
always.
that way.
Yeah, at
But
the
you
point
got
that
there
it
a
got-
lot earlier. Yeah.
At the point we got,
Yeah.
we had too many fatalities, and government
Yes,
decided that we needed to
absolutely.
do something better. You know, we then the focus now on any construction site now. I say any again, we can start being very pedantic
No,
about. But most tier ones, there's this
Look,
go home safe.
Credit where it's due. I applaud the construction industry for the progress it's made on workplace health and safety. I've said that many times when I was chair of HSE, and I really mean it. And for me, that could and should be the starting place for making this next step.
Yes.
Because you can do it.
Yes.
Because you've done it once, and this is applying that same thinking in a different space.
Yeah. And it's focusing on the occupant, the end user, the customer,
Yes.
fundamentally.
Yes.
And that's the building control shift as well, right?
Yeah.
Around
Yeah.
the perception that they are the customer, not the person that's paying their bill.
Correct. Absolutely.
I'm interested in the point you made about people wanting to tell you what the problem was, wanting to tell you it was the cladding, and you being pushed to kind of make that sort of conclusion. What were the challenges that you had with attitudes as you started your review, going back, and we will come on more to where we are today, but back then, what were the challenges you were getting? Perhaps, I think you were somewhat critical of the fire safety industry, and not unfounded. In your foreword or within the report, it says, become clear to you the fire safety sector is not as strong or mature as other areas of engineering expertise. There was a high level of self-interested advocacy. I find that really interesting, and I just wonder how you were butting heads at that stage when you were trying to do your investigation to come up with your initial report.
Okay. Well, it wasn't. Let's be clear. It wasn't all hard yards in terms of coming up against resistance. Yes, there were a lot of people with preconceived ideas, and not just those who wanted the answer to be something, but also others who claimed to have already decided what the solution was, and that's no bad thing. But if it stops them listening to the bigger picture and moving, as I said earlier, from this what to why, and how do we look at this as a whole system that needs to be fixed, then that's the problem, because they were not open-minded enough to hear the rest. But the easy part of it, and there was an easy part of it in some respects, was that from the day I started on this review, there were a queue of people waiting to tell me what was wrong. The shocking thing about that was how much they knew about how the system was broken, and how nobody had either spoken up or they felt that they hadn't been listened to before. And this is not new. I've said it many times. My sense is that many of them knew already before I said it that the system was broken and needed to be fixed. What they hadn't got is that sense of urgency about needing to fix it, because none of them had anticipated that the consequences of that broken system would ever be as awful as what happened at Grenfell.
And we hear that, of course, in some of the evidence, and some of the emails we said, with the comments around, well, there aren't bodies in the street, so how bad can it be? We've heard that and seen that in the inquiry, and I think you're right. There's a fundamental understanding that things were broken, but actually the consequences of that had never been realised, and then all of a sudden you see something like Grenfell Tower happen.
The famous narrative in building safety, fire safety in purpose-built blocks of flats, that says it would be unduly pessimistic to assume, and ultimately going on to say to assume that there's a lack of compartmentation in flats.
Well, it focused on compartmentation.
Whereas what Grenfell demonstrated was actually it would be unduly optimistic to assume that it is there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think that crystallises the failings in the industry that you're talking about. And I think it seems to be in the public consciousness for so long, but you coined the phrase "the race to the bottom"
Yes.
in the fire industry,
Yes.
I think I would interpret that to mean that people want it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and so everybody's part of that system.
That's right, and many projects are set up from the start to drive those behaviours. So from the minute you accept the lowest bid, and the people who agree to build for that price, knowing they can't build for that price, and they've got to value engineer their way back into budget, you're on a path to people cutting corners and finding ways of getting away with whatever they can. So that's why it needs systemic change, because what I kept saying to people was it might not be the cladding that fails next time. It might be something else that causes a big incident. So let's not just focus on one thing. Let's focus on how do we raise the game, raise the bar across the whole industry, because the state of our building stock that we've constructed in the last 20, 30 years particularly is not good.
No. Well, it's not good. And that's where you and me spend most of our time professionally, right? Is looking at those buildings that were built over the last...
Yeah, and the truth is in the social housing industry where there's the least amount of money is the truth of it, because, everything is paid for by the tenants.
Yeah, and it's a historically poorly invested in part of the built environment.
Yeah. That would be one of my observations, and I remember very clearly a conversation with the Institution of Civil Engineers, particularly, where I said to him, "How come you've never done anything about this?" And it was obvious from the conversation that somehow or another, the built environment is very much the poor relation of the civil engineering profession compared to infrastructure and all the big stuff out there. This is very much the poor relation, and doesn't attract the same caliber of people sometimes, and certainly is also an area where the money's short, and for sure the expertise is not there, and the workforce is very mobile.
Well, yeah, of course. And I think...
And all of those are part of the problem.
The difficulty within that, I think, is that we're going down the route where there is a greater reliance of competency in the regulator. So there is a growing need now for fire engineering prowess within the building safety regulator, for example. There is a greater requirement for competent fire engineering in the fire services, much more than there ever was, because the scrutiny is significantly higher. There is also a greater draw on fire engineering prowess in the built environment, so beyond those regulators, so within the consultants that are out there designing and building and constructing. And if the money allows, you will find that all of the greatest talent goes to the consultancy side, because there is more money to pay for them. And actually, the people that need the competency more, the regulator, to be able to regulate what's going on over here, are actually the poorer cousin of that, because there isn't the money to pay for the talent. And actually, does the talent want to work there at all? Interesting
question. And I've heard this a lot over the last 5 years, since 6 years since my final report. People saying, why would people want to take on that responsibility? You'll never attract people. That's proven not to be the case.
Yeah, of course.
The building safety regulator is not struggling to attract people who want to work for them. It is having a challenge in terms of assimilating people fast enough. And I'm not going to pretend at this point that everything is working perfectly with the new building safety regulator. It isn't, because it's a new regime and they're getting up to speed, but they are aware that things are taking too long at the moment and all of that. But it is not a problem of attracting people. There are many, many people out there who want to be part of
change.
making this new system work and work for the benefit of the users, the residents.
So,
So
to be not to be controversial, but to push the point a little, if we're not so this is based on conversations I've had with a number of people across construction and fire engineering generally. There is a perception, be it right or wrong, that the quality of the people in the regulator, particularly who are overseeing some of the designs, for example, the competency isn't there. So whilst there isn't a problem to attract people, is there a problem to attract the right people or the highly competent people that perhaps it needs? Or is that just perception?
There'll be a bit of both, I think. Yes, there will be some people who are already in that regulatory space who are going to find the new role and the very different role quite difficult because it is different.
Yes.
But that's at the margins. I think the problem here is one of time and bedding in, and at the risk of sounding like, I told you so, I've been banging this drum for the last 6 years that said, this is coming, get ready, sort yourselves out. And constantly people went, oh, no, I can't do it yet. I've got to wait for the regulation, got to see the detail.
Yeah, of course.
And all of a sudden, once the regulation hits the stocks in April this year for real, people are going, oh, we're not ready.
Yeah, rabbit in headlights straight away.
Yeah.
Didn't know this was coming.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, you did, and you were warned.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say probably, Dave and I certainly, but most listeners will have heard you say that in person probably. It's coming, prepare yourself, start making change. And I think a lot of us found ourselves talking to the boards of large organisations saying, it's coming, you need to prepare for it. And the stock answer is the answer that you give there, but we've got to see the detail. We don't want to move too soon. What if we do too much? And actually the whole point is do too much.
Yes.
That's the right thing to be doing. And if you've got the ability to scale that back because you feel you're doing too much, fine. But actually, waiting for the bare minimum is not where you should be. You should be forcing the way through to do the right thing.
And that's back to, do you understand the message here, which is your focus needs to be on providing safe buildings for people to live in. You can be the best judge of that. You're the experts. The regulator is there to test and satisfy themselves that you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
But you are the ones in the industry who need to take ownership and responsibility for, we are proud to say that we are building safe buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't actually need to be a rocket scientist to identify what a safe building looks like, really.
Nope.
Although people do make it very, very difficult sometimes, on purpose, I think.
Yes.
But fundamentally, tall buildings aren't actually that complicated. From a fire safety engineer, they're not complex on a floor-by-floor level.
Though, Tom, is bringing it back to sort of competency. It's not that they're overly complex, but regardless of whether people are attracted to go and work for the building regulator or not, there is somewhat of a lack of young people entering the industry. For example, if you look at the fire industry or the number of fire engineers or the amount of vacancies there are for fire risk assessors, consultancies and within social housing organisations, and the vacancies they have for expertise, there's just not enough to go around. And I have a view that there is a lack of people being brought into the industry sort of at the lowest level, and there have been artificially inflated salaries at the higher end, people who perhaps are underqualified. That's getting better with the advent of the Tier 3 register and people recognising that that's becoming a standard expectation for people working on those sort of complex buildings. But I think that there is a greater grassroots issue of bringing people through and making them competent.
But it does demonstrate, doesn't it, actually, that there isn't more building work going on now than there ever was. There's a lot more. There's a lot of building work going on, but actually, if you find yourself in a situation where there isn't the competency out there to deliver stuff, it proves the point, right? That there wasn't anyone doing the right stuff. There wasn't enough people doing what needs to be done to design and construct good quality, safe housing for people that are going to live in them. mean, that's why we've got no one in the industry, because it was, fire safety was always a grudge purchase. Fire engineering was someone that turned up, did something at Reba Stage 3, never did anything at Reba Stage 5, and would just disappear into the ether. And actually now you've got fire engineers quoting at Reba Stage 2 and 3 and will be drawn through the entire process right to the end of Reba Stage 5.
We're starting to talk about some interesting stuff now, because for me, that when I now talk about, there's things about this new regime that people still don't get. Some of the things you're now touching on are where I would go to, so this whole tell me what to do and I'll do it is still there. But also I don't think the industry yet has really grasped the level of collaboration that is now required and the continuity that is required all the way through the process.
Yes.
Yes, we talk about the golden thread of information, but that's only part of it. The record of information that gets passed through there is one part of that. But the very fact that you've had structures in place in the past that actually discouraged the architect from staying involved in the project into construction, what is that all about?
Yeah.
The person who designs it and has the vision for what it needs to look like needs to be part of a team. And when you get to the end of it, you say, we've built what we set out to build.
Yes.
But it's we, not, oh, look, by accident, this whole series of people have ended up building what I kind of thought I wanted to see.
Yeah. Which is why you sort of say, well, I don't want to bring the design architect on board for this part. I'm going to have a delivery architect for this bit because they're better at doing the build.
So some of these cultural issues around, artificial barriers and fragmentation are some of the things that have still got to be shifted, in my view, before we will get this new regime working in the way that it needs to work.
So you clearly see there's a need for interdisciplinary knowledge and collaboration between different...
Yes, absolutely.
How do we get that? How do we get to that next stage then? How do we drive that?
I think that's very much for the industry to decide, and to give credit where it's due, I think groups like the Construction Leadership Council are looking at that and are trying to foster it, which is really great. And let's also not talk ourselves into into depression here. There are some green shoots out there. There are some good companies out there who are leading the way. And I'm really pleased to see that, because it shows what's possible. And for people within the industry to be modelling that is the best way of showing everyone else the way forward, rather than me wagging the finger at them. So I think
nice to hear Frankham and CLM are doing the right
bottom
thing.
line is it's got to be driven by the industry.
Sure.
Yeah, but I think I can say that the majority of my clients now in the fire protection specialist contracting part of our business, we are a long way away from where we would have been 5 to 10 years ago, which would have been a building gets designed, starts getting built, and then they make a telephone call during Reba Stage 5, and someone from the fire protection industry would turn up in a red van with a load of bat and mastic in, and they'd go in and they'd be faced with a hole with some services going through it. They cut the bat appropriately, put some mastic in, put a sticker on it, and walk away. And actually, now that organisation, in the context of our organisation, we are at the design table at Reba Stage 3, sometimes
Absolutely.
Reba Stage 2. We're certainly there at Reba Stage 4, and we're going through all of the letterbox details, all of the builders' work openings, and making sure that the services are spaced appropriately and it's the right material and there's a tested solution or an extended field of application that's been approved. And then when you turn up at Reba Stage 5, you know what's going in that hole because you've got it on a piece of paper in front of you, and you install it. And that really is a sea change. I mean, that is literally a sea change where you are actually getting a seat around the table, where you do have some say around what that design is going to do. And you have the power to say, little old me as a passive fire protection operative has the impact over the biggest package on site, apart from structure, which is the M&E structure, the M&E package, to say, that pipe going through that hole is in the wrong place. You need to move it a little bit so I can do my bit. and you're now in a position where the design is happening in a collaborative way that allows you to make those changes so you get the best outcomes on site.
Yeah, and as we speak, the problem we're seeing at the moment within the new regime is that people are really struggling with Gateway 2. And the ones who are struggling are the ones who are not doing that.
Yes.
So then when they get asked questions by the regulator about, what have you done about this? Demonstrate to me that you've looked at fire safety already, and show me what you've done. I haven't done that yet. So they can't.
Yeah.
So to me, this kind of temporary place we're at where Gateway 2 is proving to be quite difficult. Some of that's to do with, as I said, the regulator getting up to speed, but that's transient and will get fixed. But a large part of it is about those parts of the industry that haven't yet got needing to behave differently.
Yes.
And work more collaboratively in order to be able to get through that part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. You just talked about competence, and me and Dave's real intention for the episode was to talk about competence. We haven't gone there at all yet, really. Have we?
Touched on it.
We touched a little bit, but I think that the behaviours element has started to bleed into the definition of competency. So where previously it might be education, training and experience would be sort of the definition of competency to some extent, behaviour has been added on by certain people or not necessarily by industry, but so behaviour is being bled into competency. Do you believe that behaviour is a core part of competency, or is behaviour just a core part of being a good engineer or a good designer or a good architect?
I think it's fundamental. It's fundamental that you don't only do the job, but you do it and understand why it's important that you do it well.
Yeah.
Because that's what we've been suffering from for so long. People just doing it. And
it's behaviour of the company as well as behaviour of the individual, isn't it?
Yes, of
Yes.
course.
The way companies
Overall
work.
behaviours.
Indeed,
right.
yeah.
But I'm back to my, it's not enough to know what to do. You've got to know why you're doing that. So if you are involved in fire stopping, and within the construction of a building, if you don't understand how important that is in providing the layers of protection for that building, and the fact that if it's not done properly, you are creating a risk in that building, then you're not competent.
Yeah,
it's
of
not
course.
enough to know
How to do it.
I have to do it like this because I've looked at all the pictures and I've seen it. You've got to know why it's important.
Yes, and it becomes an important layer of that fire protection that's been designed.
Yeah.
And if you think, well, my layer's not that important, and you don't do it properly,
Yeah.
and everyone else has got that behaviour,
Yeah.
then actually you're in that position where it's very, very easy
Yeah.
for that Swiss cheese to line up.
Exactly.
Because everyone's little hole was just because they didn't think it was
I am really
important.
pleased that you know about the Swiss cheese.
Regrettably, a master's required me to spend a lot of time thinking about Swiss cheese, and not in the way I would have liked.
You touched very briefly on the golden thread, almost giving the impression that that's not the. You've talked enough about that sort of thing, and that's not the key focus.
Not at all. Not
okay.
at all.
Okay, I didn't mean to characterise. That's what you meant. But what I was going to ask was how are you seeing that technology and digital tools are assisting people in improving competency, or is it starting to is it muddying the waters?
All of the above, quite clearly, right? So let me just be clear that the golden thread of information is very, very important. What I was trying to say earlier was that's not the end of the story. Unless if people over rely upon the golden thread of information as being the only way that communication happens throughout that supply chain that goes with the life of the building, then we are not where we need to be, because it's about people interacting as well as the flow of information. But let's not in any way get away from the fact that today, when you look backwards, the amount of information that people have about the buildings makes it nigh on impossible for them to manage them in occupation, because they don't know enough about them, because nobody kept the records, the thoughts on what changed and why, and all of that isn't there. So how do you start to manage the building from that position? So golden thread, fundamental. Is it being helped by IT solutions? Yes. Are there people out there making it overly complicated with their IT solutions? Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. But that always happens, right? It always happens in any space. I spent a long time, as people may remember, at the HSE, trying to make the distinction between people who are providing good, proportionate advice on what you need to do on health and safety, and those who were telling people to do far more than the regulator wanted,
so
simply
in terms
because they were making money out of selling a system.
Yes. So in terms
it's
of
the same thing.
Overcomplicating those digital systems, what you're saying is it doesn't need to be overly complicated.
No,
you just need a vehicle,
it needs to be fit for purpose.
Doesn't need to pay tens of thousands of pounds for some
and
new
worse
IT
still,
system.
If you capture every bit of data about the building, and you end up with a file, the size of the house itself, then that's no use to man the beast, right? It's got to be
usable.
It's got to be about what's really important, and it's got to be in a usable form.
And you would focus that towards what the BSA is essentially saying is what the focus of safety is. There's an interesting point on that, whilst you're on that subject, and it's a bit of a curveball. It was from an article from John Powell, we talk about in his episode, about he raises the number of fatalities in the UK from asbestos. From asbestos-related diseases and that sort of thing, and obviously there's a regime in place for asbestos and that kind of thing. But the number of fatalities is significantly higher than the number of fatalities caused by fire. Yet the focus, it's almost brushed under the carpet these days. I suppose it wasn't mentioned in the BSA, in the Building Safety Act at all. And just wondered if you view that as an oversight, or was that something that could be added in later?
Sweeping asbestos under the carpet, Dave.
It wasn't supposed to be that.
It's too serious a subject, isn't it? Really, for all of that. Asbestos is a tragedy, absolute tragedy, but it's a tragedy by and large of the past. The number of fatalities that are happening today were caused by asbestos exposure 20 and 30 years ago. The real tragedy is that there's still people out there who have been exposed to it, who are going to get asbestosis and mesothelioma, and there's very little we can do about that legacy that is coming through the system. The bit that we can make a difference to is ensuring that exposure now doesn't result in more deaths 20 and 30 years from now. And that, I think, we are on top of. It is a problem of the past by and large. Do you
think it was perhaps a missed opportunity to refresh it by including it within the BSA, or...?
No, because it's already covered, in my view, perfectly adequately in relation to the Health and Safety at Work Act. Because by and large, the people who are exposed to asbestos are people who are working in buildings. The biggest problem is, do they know what to look for, and do they know what to do when they find it? That's already part of the remit of HSE, and we have a pretty good system in place in terms of how that gets handled. So I think we should... It all comes together for the duty holder. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that it's unimportant, but the duty holder already knows what they have to do on asbestos. Well, the Building Safety Act was all about a new focus on a new set of issues.
Sure. I think possibly what would concern me about that, I agree that is in place already and that is generally understood. However, what the fire industry was undergoing shortly before Grenfell happened was that race to the bottom in terms of costs, and I think asbestos is now the poor relation, that there's a race to the bottom in terms of costs, that it's just not seen as a priority by a lot of housing organisations, for example, or organisations in general.
Again, that's back to industry attitudes by and large, isn't it? In as much as, because something new comes along that you now have to do as well as all of the things you had to do before, it is exactly that. You've got to do it as well as.
Yeah.
Not ask the question of, well, if I'm doing this, can I stop doing something else? No, you can't.
The inference of John's article that we talked about, is it an inference that there is people taking their eye off the ball around asbestos because they are focusing on fire? Or is it that there is an inference that asbestos exposure is increasing by virtue of the remedial actions that are being taken because of fire?
I think it's looking at the dichotomy that the amount of money that's invested in elements of fire safety, the equivalent consideration isn't paid these days to asbestos. And it's resulted in a driving to the bottom of prices, particularly in the residential sector, where they've got, in fairness, other things to pay for. A lot of them are paying for.
Well, there is a bigger issue here, isn't it? And I think rather than focusing on one specific like asbestos, we should broaden this out to the bigger issue, which I hear about a lot, which is particularly in relation to buildings that are already there. So we always have to remember when we have this debate about the Building Safety Act that there's a whole set of issues around how do we raise the standard of what gets built in the first place, or when you're doing new build.
Sure.
Then you get into this much, much more difficult territory of when we start looking at what we've already got, and you're peeling back the layers and you're finding things that you really don't like. And then you end up with a list of things that some need to be fixed, some it would be nice to fix. And that whole business of prioritising both the new things you uncover against what in many cases is already quite a long list of things that needed to be fixed and a budget to manage. How do you prioritise all of that? Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
But it is all about having your eye on the long term, coming up with a programme and recognising that you have a regulator in place that is used to taking a proportionate approach, that will not demand that you do everything instantly, but will expect you to have thought about what can you do now that will make the biggest difference to make people safe. And that's the exam question. What is the biggest single thing you could do to have the most impact on improving the safety of this building?
Was there anything in your report, going back to the report and what you've seen since then, that you feel has been missed in that point? Is there anything that you feel hasn't really been seized upon? You had a series of main sort of chapters that are generally been addressed in different ways, but is there something fundamental that you feel has not yet been jumped on in the way that which you intended?
Yes, and that's why I'm hopeful that Sir Martin Morbick's public inquiry is going to resurrect this issue around products, because I am still worried that we've corrected the building regulatory system around the actors in that system, but we have yet to really address the issue of how do you know you're using the right things that are and that they are fit for purpose, and that you're not being, passed off with substandard materials? And the answer is we don't. And that is the current hole in the system that worries me most.
So the Moral Day report obviously starts talking about testing and focusing on product.
Yeah.
And within the testing market in particular, they identified that there was a real kind of stripping out of quality of competency, particularly within the UK market. And the idea around capacity was focused on the actual number of furnaces that existed rather than the actual issue around capacity in creating standards that can keep up with novel building techniques, for example, the ability for someone to regulate against the testing regime, the number of furnaces and obviously the number of frames that perhaps exist in that space as physical assets, the number of people that are there to do the test, the number of people that are there to interpret the results, the number of people that can then certify the product. And obviously Moral Day the report obviously identifies that there is a fundamental failure in that testing market. And obviously that builds into what you're talking about around products. And part of my worry is that unless you are an educated client, how do you know whether the products that either you are purchasing or the products that your design team are specifying for you on your behalf, fundamentally, how do you have confidence in that? And my view was always, well, just surround yourself with the most competent people. And actually, you're probably halfway there.
Yeah,
is it as simple as that in your mind?
I don't think it's as simple as that. Of course, but I would agree with your comment that it takes you a long way in the right direction. It is about having competent people who, in the right roles, who know what they're doing and who know what they're asking for. And again, who understand why it's important that the things they procure are to specification. But then you have to have a loop in that system that ensures that what gets delivered to site is what you asked for.
Yes.
And that is why I have got into so many conversations in the last 5 years about, would you recommend we went back to Clerk of Works? Well, it's one answer.
Yeah.
Because that was a big gateway in the system in the past where, someone was checking on what was being delivered. And if it wasn't what you asked for...
Yeah. Do you think construction's too lean now on site? Do you think there's a real leaning out of management on site, perhaps? Maybe in that chase of improved profitability, perhaps. I mean, it's sort of taking that picture of, well, you lose someone important like the Clerk of Works.
I don't know. I don't honestly know the answer to that question. I mean, from a sort of non-expert perspective, I am surprised that this industry has not gone further than it has with modular factory construction, because that is a way of delivering better quality assurance in the factory.
In fact, we've seen the inverse. We've seen people that deliver that going out of business. Actually, it's gone the other way, actually.
Yeah. But that's back to, there's a lot of self-interested people in this sector who maybe don't want that to happen at the pace it should. But there's a bigger point here, which is it doesn't all have to be about warm bodies on site.
Of course.
There are many ways in which you can use technology to do a lot of this.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Look at what and again, one of my pleas to this industry is look at how everybody else does it. Scanning barcodes, all this kind of stuff. There are many, many different ways of doing this. It doesn't have to be by going back to what you had in the past.
Yes.
But when you strip out some of those checking processes, you have to replace them with something else to do the job.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
How do you, obviously we're sort of seven years down the road now.
Since do maths, yeah.
Yeah, since the tragedy, yes.
Yes.
Strong point. How do you see the framework for the building safety framework evolving over the next sort of even 10 years, 20 years?
Well, the next big step is very close, right? Which is to look long and hard at what the public inquiry says about the specifics of Grenfell itself. And if you go back to my report, it says in there quite clearly, this sets us on a direction of travel, but we will have to come back and revisit this when the public inquiry provides its recommendations. So the next step in this journey, and it is a journey, will be to examine what the public inquiry says and to go back to what we've now put in place and say, is there anything we've missed? Are there any things we now need to add on to this as a result of the, much more in-depth and very specific inquiry that has been done?
Would there
for
be
the last
likely to
7
be
years?
any sort of what's the word, addendum or a second part of the Building Safe for Future report? Does that need revisiting or extending in some way, just to review or reviewing?
That's for the new government to decide, I think, in terms of how they want to take that forward. But what I think it's important for us to remember is that whilst the public inquiry has been going on for the last 7 years, we have actually shifted to a very different place and are on a journey now. And it would be, I think, a great pity if we were to unstitch that and go off in a different direction. The real challenge now is how to build on whatever it is the public inquiry says to the new framework that we've now put in place.
How to augment it and make it
Yeah.
stronger,
So
more.
tweaking the course rather than
Yeah.
doing a U-turn.
Yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise it will take the industry 7 years again to get back anywhere useful.
Yeah.
It seems that construction just seems to be, and I call it construction because fundamentally all of it is construction. It just seems to be a big ship that either doesn't want to turn or finds it very, very difficult to turn.
Well, I think it's very difficult to turn because it's so fragmented. And everybody's able to point at somebody else and say, you go first. But that shouldn't make it impossible.
No, there is definitely that parapet mentality, particularly in the big tier ones.
Yeah.
Who's going to be the first to
Yeah.
do something dramatic?
And, I want to say it again, there are some out there who are leading the way already. And all power to them. What I'd dearly love to see emerge from this is an accreditation system, not for the products
For the
in the
firms.
sense of the building materials, but for the products in the sense of buildings built by this team of people in this way.
Yes.
You can be confident in. So
They do something like that in New South Wales, don't they? There is a
they do
certification
And,
system, a licensing
yeah.
actually.
It's a whole. They accredit individual companies in the supply chain, and then that results in being able to say, because this team of people were involved in all of the different aspects of this, we can now accredit this building.
Yeah.
I think it's a great system, and I've been doing a lot of work in Australia over the last 5 years, in Victoria as it happens, but I've been looking closely at what they've been doing in New South Wales as well. And yeah, I think it's got a lot of merits, and I'd love to see us do something similar.
I mean, to the extent that the chief building chap goes onto LinkedIn and completely decimates organisations. Yeah. Which is fantastic. He talks about the organisations, he talks about the building, how long it's been sat there, that these companies no longer licensed. There's a real kind of authority around that building environment in New South Wales, and as a result of that, I'm assuming you get greater consumer confidence in what they are buying, which is fundamentally at the root of what you are
That's
advocating
what we all need
for.
to focus on getting to. Yes. Yeah.
You're pointing towards the Australian framework there to a certain extent. Are there any other examples from our international neighbours that you would like to see brought into the way we're doing things? That's quite a good example already. Is there other things that Australia, would you say, significantly ahead of us in those areas?
Australia, found themselves in very much the same place that we were 7 years ago. They were fortunate in as much as they didn't have fatalities, but they had a number of really serious building fires and indeed a structural collapse of a building, you know, and a building that they had, a brand new building that they had to evacuate because it was structurally unsafe.
From their mistakes.
So they...
From their tragedies rather.
Well, I think we were in the same place at about the same time,
right?
Because what's been clear to me in all the conversations I've had is wherever you go in the world, there isn't one single person that I've met that looks at what happened at Grenfell and says, "Oh, that couldn't happen here." Yeah. I think everyone has been humbled and have really done some soul searching around what do we need to learn from Grenfell. Some have moved on and said, "Oh, we're all right for now," but I think others, like the Australians, are very much trying to address the issue. It's more challenging for them in as much as they have, you know, different state jurisdictions, which means there's a bit of non-joined up thinking going on between the different states. But nonetheless, if you read the Shergold-Weir report that came out at about the same time as mine, you could, you know, rub the names off the front and put mine on, and vice versa. You know, they were saying the same things.
Yeah, I mean, Australia has a prevalence of ACM on the walls in some of its buildings because of the weather conditions. Obviously, how close it is to Asia, and obviously that's where a lot of those materials would have come from in the Australian market, and they struggle with a number of things like quality of aluminium, quality of steel, quality of product, assurance of product, certification. And obviously they had their, well, it's not their Grenfell at all, but the lacrosse fire obviously was a fire.
And there's been a sudden growth in high rise in Australia, you know, which in some respects is surprising given how much land they've got available. But everybody wants to live in the city, so in places like Melbourne and Sydney and so on, there's been such a spurt in high rise building that many of the same practices prevail. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay. I can see that your brain's got a million questions and mine has too, but I'm conscious we've been here for probably a lot longer than we normally would be, which is fantastic. So I thank you very much for...
My pleasure.
Yeah, I think we're going to have
persevering with us
to wrap it up soon. Obviously, my closing questions are around Dame Judith's opinion of Backdraft and whether she's going to join our...
The movie Backdraft. Yeah.
An ongoing campaign for the series that we're trying to get people to join the Backdraft Appreciation Society.
Okay.
Free to join, doesn't cost anything.
Dave's favourite movie. So Dave was a firefighter in the Navy, and I was a firefighter in the Air Force, which is our background. And as a result of that, Dave is very excited about old movies because obviously you can see he's a lot older than.
No, I'm going to show my ignorance now. So this is Kurt Russell, right?
Yes, thank you.
See. So what Dave is looking for, other than the founding member of the Appreciation Society, is someone who isn't us two to be in his little club.
You get a photo of Kurt Russell emailed to you once a month.
If you remember,
with no
I believe
context.
is the caveat.
Well,
you just get a picture of Kurt.
Just to remind you of that awesome movie that is Backdraft.
You think it's better than Towering Inferno?
Oh,
I think
Steve McQueen. Steve, I don't know. Yes, I do. Do you know what? I'm going to stick to my guns. Yes, I do.
As long as they keep building them.
Yeah, but
think
about it. Yes, he did. And think about what the whole of the first half of the film was about.
100%.
Cost cutting and corner cutting and people knowing they were doing it.
Exactly.
In Towering Inferno.
Exactly. It's a fantastic movie and some great quotes. And actually, if you go back, exactly as you say, you go back to the first half, the whole point of it literally points to our entire regulatory environment, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's the same thing. Yeah. So I think I'm going to start my own website, Dave, which is the Towering Inferno Appreciation Society, and I'm going to try and get Dame Judith Hackitt to be my first member.
You're going to send out a picture of Paul Newman or Steve McQueen?
Yes, I think we should. I think we should, for sure. As the series goes on, I think Dave's going to ask me questions about his favourite film, because he doesn't truly believe I've ever seen it, which I think might break our friendship in half.
There's a remake being made, and I'm keen that we become the...
You want to be on the press junket, don't you?
Yeah, the champions for that movie.
Yes.
In spite of the fact that the fire science within it is atrocious.
Yes.
Horrendous.
Absolutely.
You know what? It makes me sad that we're going to make a remake of it, because where I'd like to combine both of those movies to is history.
Yeah.
That's where they belong. You know, we should be able to look back and say that was then, but we don't do that anymore.
Yeah. It's a very good point. See, I now don't like the fact that you like that movie. I'm now going to become friends with Dame Judith Hackitt instead. She's much better at movies, for sure. Any more? Are you done?
I'm done.
Wonderful. Okay, right. So I think it's important to note that we are an independent and neutral, and anyone that wants to get involved with the show can indeed message us on LinkedIn. And if we want you, we'll find you, won't we, Dame Judith? We find you somehow.
Oh yeah.
And we want you to follow our page. We would love to hear from all of you, and we'd love to, if you want to appear on the show in the future or comment, or you got any questions about what we've said in the past, then obviously drop us a message, and we'll bring you down to our studio in London Bridge to discuss it. Thank you, Dame Judith, for your time. Much appreciated. And Dave, as ever, thank you for yours.
You're welcome, Tom.